So thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm going to talk about strategy as my practice, and then I'm going to extrapolate that into what's happening in organizations, what's happening in management as a consequence, what's happening in organizations, and what's happening in societies in the world. I want to kind of take this onto a bigger plane. I am not this tall, and Shasha's not that small, although she's fairly small and I'm fairly small, but one chair kind of left me a little low, so I piled two chairs up, not to dominate you, but I couldn't find a pillow handy, so I did that. I'm going to review very briefly kind of some of the milestones in my own work and strategy, very briefly, because I want to get into some of the consequences of that. But let me just say, in 1967, as a doctoral student, I published an article in the Sloan, what was called the Industrial Management Review, and now it's called the Sloan Management Review. That was 1967. Joe and I just recently did an article, Joe Marquez and I just recently did an article in the same journal that many years later. It was called The Science of Strategy Making, but I got past that soon enough about the science of strategy making. And a few years later I did an article called Strategy Making in Three Modes, which was pretty similar to what I've been doing ever since. You want to sort of... it's pretty similar to what I've been doing ever since. In the sense, it was the precursor of what came next. And then around that time, I discovered a comment by Herbert Simon. It was just a passing comment in something I read. Simon, of course, was the kind of ultimate thinker in management, responsible for the kinds of business schools we have today, for better and for worse. But he almost single-handedly made our business schools much more respectable, much more academic, and much more disconnected from practice at the same time. Not that they were very connected to practice before that, but he was a brilliant man who won one of these non-Nobel Prizes in economics. There's no Nobel Prize in economics, but they call it that, and he won it. Nobel only created 5 prizes, not 6. And he said, the series of decisions which determines behavior over some stretch of time may be called a strategy. And with that, that was a kind of revelation for me, and with that I was off. Strategy as pattern in decision making, which we eventually changed to strategy as pattern in action. That when you see a consistency in what an organization does, you're kind of seeing a strategy as realized, not necessarily as intended. In other words, an organization can have a strategy without even realizing they have a strategy. They can be consistent in their behaviors, in their actions, and those consistencies infer a kind of strategy which may be unbeknownst even to them, but is perceived as pattern in some other people's view. And that led to the whole idea of strategy as emergent versus deliberate, because if you intend to have a strategy by the usual definition, and you realize it through a pattern, then you've implemented what you formulated, and that becomes a deliberate strategy. Whereas if you take a whole bunch of actions all over the place, and eventually they converge into a pattern, that becomes what we call an emergent strategy. And this whole talk is going to be about deliberate and emergent and different aspects of it. I teamed up, I started to do some research on different organizations and patterns in their actions, and eventually teamed up with Jim Waters, a wonderful colleague. And Jim, I had been calling it retroactive strategy and not emergent strategy. And Jim said, no, retroactive's no good. So I really owe thanks to Jim for changing that name to emergent strategy, which I think is a much better label. Okay, so we studied all kinds of organizations. We studied the National Film Board of Canada. We studied a supermarket chain in Canada. We studied Air Canada. We studied Volkswagen. We studied US strategy in Vietnam, and so on, trying to figure out these patterns and why they form and what's deliberate and what's emergent, and when you see deliberate and when you see emergent. And the whole thing is published in a book with Oxford University Press called Tracking Strategies. Okay, so that's kind of where I was and kind of more or less where I am. And let me tell you a story about that. Early on, I went and gave a talk at the Harvard Business School. And I can still picture the room. You know, sometimes you have an event that happens in your life and you can still see the place, even though there are just millions of images that have gone before and since, and a few images. I can see that room right now. And it wasn't that big. There were maybe 30, 40 people in the room, faculty. And I presented this idea of deliberate and emergent strategy, and there was kind of almost pandemonium in the room, like, how can you talk about emergent strategy? And I mean, Harvard was training people through case study methods to do absolutely deliberate strategy. They even had people, and still do, their students still do, sit in rooms, read cases, and then decide what the strategy of that organization should be. They're all experts in the organization because they read 20 pages about it the day before, so they all know all about that. And they were training leaders to formulate strategies the way Ken Andrews had told them to formulate strategies in the well-known textbook of the time. Ken Andrews was in the room, by the way, and he was one of the few people who wasn't kind of shouting at me at the same time, but about 8 of them were at one point kind of quite upset. And there happened to be, this shows you how long ago this was, there happened to be 2 overhead projectors, just by chance. Or maybe I requested, I can't remember. Anyway, there were 2 overhead projectors, and I kind of stood there and I said, you know what? That's deliberate strategy, and that's emergent strategy. And what happens in strategy happens in the middle. You never get a perfectly deliberate strategy. You never get formulation carried through to implementation in every little detail. And they had gone on about, of course, we know that our strategies formulated, get adapted and so on. I said, that's no good unless you realize that there's another end to that continuum. To say this is what we're teaching and practice kind of varies a little bit from here is not sufficient. What you have to do is say, this is deliberate strategy, this is emergent strategy, they're equally valid, and strategic behavior happens in between in all kinds of ways. And if you're interested in that, see a paper I did with Jim called Of Strategies Deliberate and Emergent in the Strategic Management Journal, and it talks about all those in-between ways. Okay. Now, so that became my practice. My practice was to study how strategies developed and to ask myself, to what extent, and I shouldn't say myself because it was with Jim and it was with all kinds of assistants who did these studies and worked with us on the conclusions, and we went, and it was to kind of find out when things are more deliberate, when things are more emergent, why that is, and all kinds of factors that did that. Okay, now I want to take the concept of emergent and deliberate strategy and bump it up. I want to bump it up to talk about management education and development, about management practice, and how that relates to what's going on in the world today, from how our societies are going out of balance to how this world is going out of balance. And I hope you'll see that this is not a huge leap, but in fact I think I can be coherent enough to make all those connections. So by the way, I talked about this yesterday at the Teaching and Learning Conference, but I suspect there isn't that much overlap, and if there is, you're the lucky ones, because you probably need to hear this twice to figure what the heck I'm talking about. So the others of you will have to look at the recording. We're recording this. So I'm going to start with an experience that is particularly compelling, or kind of was a bit of an epiphany, and it happened last week. And something happened in our classroom that sort of gelled or brought together my thinking over a long period of time about all kinds of things, including a kind of model of strategy and teaching and practice as deliberate versus a model of management practice and teaching as emergent. And I think we can sort of view those two. So we ran and are running right now, actually, because it's going on for a week and a half. We have a program called the International Masters for Health Leadership. It's a very novel kind of program. I'll mention a few things about it in a minute. But we do all kinds of wild and woolly things in this program. We have a great time. And this particular model, there are 5 models of 11 days each over a year and a half. And this particular module, the second one, is called, is about at least organizations. The first one is about self. The second one's about organizations. The third one's about the context of organizations, the world around them. But this one's about organizations, and it's called the analytic mindset. That doesn't mean we're teaching analysis. We do a bit of that, but it means we're sort of questioning and looking into analysis and asking ourselves about the role of analysis in organizations. And we opened the week, you opened the module, with a session called Evidence and Experience in Medicine and Management. And we had everybody plot themselves in terms of their practice, whether they're physicians or public health people or community health people or nurses, wherever they are, they all plotted themselves on a continuum between evidence and experience, where they went. And then we took all these, they each did it, and then we took it and put it on one big flip chart and looked at how the whole class, 35 people, saw themselves between evidence and experience, and then we got into all kinds of discussions and workshops. They told each other stories about evidence that worked and evidence that didn't work, experience that worked and experience that didn't work. And as you well know, in medicine, that's a big issue, evidence-based medicine. And it's kind of some discussion in management. And the consensus, virtually everybody in the class, I think it's fair to say, the consensus was it's not about evidence or experience. It's about how you bring evidence and experience to bear on even the most sophisticated medical practice. In fact, we had a category of physicians called acute medical practice, and they ranged, you would think they would lean much more to evidence. They ranged right across how they saw themselves, from very experience-based to very evidence-based. So there was a kind of consensus that you need balance. Keep the word balance in mind. Okay, a couple of days later, we did a session, a day and a half, on strategy. 3 of us, we work a lot in teams in this program, and Saku, who you all know, and Corey Phelps, who's also just joined the Guild recently. The 3 of us worked on this day and a half on strategy. And Corey presented the economic perspective on strategy, and I presented the kind of what I called the learning perspective on strategy, or the emergent view of strategy and strategy as a learning process, and Saku presented on strategic organization. And so they got 3 lenses on how you view strategy. And then the next day, Saku concocted this wonderful workshop. We have all kinds of crazy workshops we do. And Saku came up with a new one where we divided the class into 3. So we had 15 in one corner, 15 in another, and 15 in a third part of the room. And they were going to be trained to be the experts on each lens. So there was a strategy as learning lens, and an economic lens, and a strategic organization lens, and so on. And then they were going to regroup into smaller groups and discuss issues that they were concerned with in healthcare with at least one expert from each of the 3 perspectives. So they're sitting in these 3 corners, and they're discussing among themselves for about 10 minutes, kind of what questions they want to ask, what they want to find out, how they want to get to better know their particular lens. And once they had their questions in mind, we would join them, and we would sit there for another half an hour explaining our particular lens. So it was kind of a fun exercise. Well, I sit down in my group about strategy as learning, and the first question that comes to me was, I'll have to turn the page here. The first question that comes to me was, but isn't the economic view also about learning too? Wasn't Corey talking about learning just like you were talking about learning? And I thought, gee, of course, how can I say, I can't call this a learning perspective. Corey was a learning perspective, Saku was a learning perspective, I was a learning perspective. But then something hit me like a ton of bricks. And that is, Corey, in presenting the economic view, was really talking about learning from evidence. And I was talking about learning from experience. And our whole program, our whole philosophy in the IMHL, the healthcare program, and also the IMPM, the business edition, the business version, International Masters in Practicing Management, I was talking, our programs are largely about learning from experience. Our view is we take managers who are mid-career or people practitioners in the healthcare program in mid-career, and we base the whole learning, or a huge part of the learning, on their experience and learning from each other. So they don't sit in U-shaped classrooms, they sit at round tables, so they can go in and out of workshops constantly. And it's all about how can you take what we just did and take it into your own context, and how can you use this based on your experience, and they reflect on it, they share their experience with each other, and so on and so forth. We have a 50-50 rule that says half the time it's over to them on their experience. Okay, so, and just to talk very briefly about some of the things we do morning reflections where they reflect on what they heard yesterday and concerns in their heads. They write a bit in their insight books, an empty book about thinking about this. They share around the table. Then we do plenaries. We do managerial exchanges where they pair up and spend the better part of a week at each other's workplace. They do friendly consulting, where they bring in personally an issue that's of concern to them, and their colleagues act as consultants to each other. We do all kinds of things, and they love that stuff. They absolutely love that stuff, and they love learning from their own experience. And then it occurred to me that while we have a largely experience-based program, conventional business education, I wouldn't even call it management education, conventional business education is about learning from evidence. It's about the research, it's about theory, it's basically about accumulated evidence. It's not about experience, especially with the young people in a young MBA program. They don't have much experience. They can't bring experience to the classrooms, but we can bring evidence to the classroom. So we've designed our programs largely about bringing evidence, about us bringing evidence to them and lecturing and doing whatever we can. And if you go on the Wharton website, they've been doing this for years, they changed the wording a little bit, a website about the eMBA program, they say you get the same in the Wharton eMBA that you get in the regular Wharton MBA program. Of course, what they're saying is, we're not cheating you. We have a famous MBA program. You're getting just as good as that. And I'm reading this as, you mean you're boasting that you do no more for people with experience than you do with 25-year-olds who have virtually no managerial experience. You're boasting about that? That's the state of management education today. And it's not management education at all, it's business education. It does very well on business issues like marketing and finance and all that. It's dreadful, I think, and distorted for management education. So that's where we sit. A word about case studies. Cases are not evidence, not experience. Cases are not experience. They're experience 3 steps removed. Livingston wrote a famous article in the Harvard Business Review many years ago, and he was a Harvard professor, called oh my goodness, I'm trying to remember, the myth of the well-educated manager. And he was talking about cases being second-hand, but they're not, they're third-hand. Somebody has an experience, some case writer goes in, that's second-hand, and writes about the experience, and then some professor picks it up and does it in the classroom, that's third-hand. That's not experience. In fact, Harvard's been running a series of ads. They were doing it last year. I don't know if they're still doing it in The Economist and presumably other places. And you have this woman who looks like an executive in the ad saying, we do 4 cases a day. And she says, she gushes, except it's print, so I can't say she gushes, but it kind of looked like, this isn't theory, this is experience. This is nonsense. This is absolute, utter nonsense. 4 cases a day that in companies you've probably never heard of as experience, that's the state we're in, whether it's theory or presenting our research or case studies, that's where so-called management education is today. So I come down to, and this sort of came out of this experience in the healthcare program last week and so on, I sort of realized there's 2 models going on here. There's a model I call deliberate, design, and direct. Okay? And there's a model I call engage, experience, and emerge. Okay? The deliberate design and direct model is what's dominating our business schools, and it's dominating more and more management practice to its detriment. And it means it's all about the boss. One's about the boss, one's about the base. One's about leadership, one's about communityship. So leadership is about the boss on top of the hierarchy and so on. You know, Harvard people back then with those 2 overhead projectors were getting upset because they're training the great leaders. I mean, I was at MIT at the time, and they used to say, you know, some of them used to say, you know, we're training the leaders who are going to manage you as a bunch of technocrats. Well, who's the technocrats? I'll ask you, who are the technocrats? I'll get back to that in a minute. So we have 2 models, boss versus base, orchestrating versus improvising, management as a profession versus management as a practice, and so on and so forth. There's the famous Honda A and Honda B cases that Richard Pascal put together. I won't get into the details, but many of you probably know about Honda's success in the motorcycle market and how BCG as a consulting company interpreted it as a total Model A, deliberate, design, direct, and Pascal goes in and interviews the people from Honda who did this strategy in the United States, selling motorcycles in the United States, and Pascal is describing the reality as a total engage, experience, and emerge kind of behavior. So it's again back to this deliberate view and this emergent view. And the deliberate view, very centralized, very focused from the top, very leader-run, and so on and so forth, versus the emergent view. Let me give you an example of emergent strategy that I've been using over and over because I love the example. And you can see this one on the IKEA website. The heart and soul of IKEA's strategy is really the selling of unassembled furniture so that you can carry it out, put it in your car, take it home. You save money, they save money, everybody's happy, and it works quite well. And how did that come to be? And the image is, you know, they had a case study. They brought in, they had a Porter kind of person do a competitive analysis. They got all the data. They had a very important meeting, and they said, let's do disassemble furniture. I mean, that's the image, kind of. Well, that's not what happened at all. A worker, not a manager, a worker tried to put a table in his car, and it didn't fit. So he took the legs off. And somebody said, gee, if we have to take the legs off, maybe they do too. That is the heart of strategic thinking. It's that switch from not taking the legs off, that's just improvisation, but seeing the consequences of taking the legs off. That's strategic thinking. Nobody is teaching that. Nobody can teach that. It's things that people who are creative and involved, and they're actually handling tables and not sitting in offices at tables where the legs never come off. That's strategic thinking. And all right, so we've got 2 models. We've got a deliberate design direct, which is very centralized and leader run and strategic and, you know, competitive analysis and all that lovely stuff. And then we have another model that says strategy is about taking the legs off a table and recognizing the consequences of that. So let's imagine that business practice went totally to the second model and said, it's all about improvisation, it's all about creativity, it's all about taking legs off, and it's all about that. That would be nuts. That would be crazy. I mean, this doesn't make sense to view it just as that. It's got to be some combination back to the 2 overhead projectors. Well, you know what? Our regular MBA programs and more management practice, especially people educated in those programs, are about the former model and not compensating for the latter model. And that's what's throwing our companies out of balance. That's what's throwing many of our corporations out of balance, and that's what's killing a lot of enterprises today. It's killing them either in the sense it's destroying their capabilities, or else it's driving them because these aren't strategic thinkers very often. Sure, there are all kinds, but these aren't strategic thinkers very often. These are people who are doing, competitive analysis, looking at the numbers, doing all kinds of stuff like that, which is fine. I'm not opposed to competitive analysis at all. I'm opposed to it as the be-all and end-all of strategy. And these are what people are sort of doing. They're doing that kind of stuff. And so we need to, and more things are tilting in that direction, and it's not helping our organizations. And I'm going to give you an example of how it's not helping our organizations, and back to Harvard, but this could be about any business school. In 1990, a book was written by David Ewing, who was the ultimate Harvard insider, praising it to the sky. And the opening line is literally, forget the exact words, but it's literally something like, the Harvard Business School may be the most important institution on earth. The trouble with that is he was probably right. And in that book, on about the 6th page, there was a list of Harvard's most successful graduates at the time, 1990. These were all chief executives of major companies, and these were the superstars as of 1990. And I looked at that list in 2003. And it looked a bit funny. Frank Lorenzo was on that list, for example. He did a number on 3 different airlines. And there were other people on the list, kind of like, what's he doing there? Of course, in 1990, they were all he. Of course, in 1990, they looked good. So I teamed up with Joe Lampel, and we studied, this is evidence, we studied very, very carefully the careers of those 19 people from 1990 to 2003. And you know how many were absolute failures? Like getting fired by the board, bankrupting the company, stuff like that. You know how many? 10. 10 out of 19 of Harvard's best were failures. This isn't just a criticism of Harvard, because I suspect if you did it with other schools, it wouldn't be different. 4 others were questionable. We couldn't call them failures, but we certainly couldn't call them successes. 5 out of 19 were successes. One was Gerstner, who was at American Express at this point. The interesting thing about that study is not just the results. The interesting thing about that study is that we published it in 2 places. One in Fortune magazine, which was not exactly hiding it, and the other was in my book, Managers, Not MBAs, which has sold about 80,000 copies, and there's probably a few people who even read it. So there must have been people who saw that evidence. I have never seen anybody pick up on it in any way. I've never seen a follow-up study, and so on. Now, what we were saying is that the most famous successful business school in the world seemed to be failing at training chief executives, or at least whatever consequences they had. That is awfully damning. And you know what? Nobody ever did a damn thing about it. We talk about evidence, that's a joke. This is evidence, and this is evidence that you would think somebody would look at and say, we better check it out. Even today, my challenge to you is, prove us wrong. We may have been wrong, it was one sample. But it's so easy to do. Find a list from some other school of people who are chief executives, a list from years back. It's an easy thing to do. We don't analyze ourselves. We are so obsessed with analyzing. We are so obsessed with evidence. We are so oriented towards research. And something like this happens and nobody blinks. What the heck is going on in our business schools, I ask you. So let's take this from our classroom to broader implications, because we were talking about these 19 people, at least 10 of whom were unsuccessful. We didn't talk about their organizations, except in one case it was an advertising agency that had been renowned and went bankrupt. But what's the consequence of strategic thinkers who can't think strategically on our enterprises and on our organizations? And you know what the consequences are? If you can't think strategically, then you do other things. like you lobby the government, like you buy your competitors, like you engage in Goldman Sachs, capturing the market for recycled aluminum in the most manipulative way you can imagine. Look at the article in the New York Times. You engage in all kinds of shenanigans and in order to do what you can't do because you're not a very capable chief executive. And we are inundated we're inundated with narcissistic leadership in so many of our organizations. We've got executive compensation that announces to the world that I'm not a leader. Because if you say to your people in your company, in effect, I'm 300 times, in terms of my compensation, I'm 300 times more important than you. Is that leadership? That's the opposite of leadership. And we tolerate this. And by the way, I can't remember the source, but I seem to have seen something that said that MBAs and chief executive chairs tend to take higher compensation on average than other chief executives. So these are the people we're training. We run around saying if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. We run around saying this kind of stupidity. Whoever measured culture, whoever measured a really new product, the potential sales for a really new product. Procter & Gamble introduced Pampers and never dreamed people would use it at home. They introduced it as a travel product. Whoever measured management in any effective way, whoever measured measurement, whoever even tried to measure measurement, other than saying that it's wonderful. We just assume it. And then we use it as a hammer to hammer everybody else who's not using it, and yet there's no evidence about the use of evidence. Of course, as somebody said in the medical journal about evidence-based medicine, there's no evidence that parachutes work. There's never been a double-blind trial about I think it was in the British Medical Journal, there's never been a double-blind trial about whether parachutes work. I do a blog, mintzberg.org/blog every week, and one was called "If You Can't Measure It, You Better Manage It." That's what we need. So here we have sort of evidence about things that are going on, at least with those 19 people at Harvard, and we're not organizing it. If you take the, I don't know if I said this earlier, but I might repeat, but if you oriented management practice and management education totally toward the second module, you would distort it. But we do orient it towards the first model, towards the deliberate model, and as a result, we're distorting business practice. But let me tell you what we're doing in the classroom. I talked about a 50-50 rule. And 50% of the time is over to them on their experience, but 50% of the time is us on our evidence, like I'm doing now. I lectured to the class too. Corey lectured to the class. Saku lectured to the class. So we're presenting what in effect is our evidence, but half the time is experience. That's balance. What we have in our organizations that are tilting so far, so many of them, not all of them, because a lot of entrepreneurial organizations don't buy into any of that. So they're very boss-oriented, but they're not distorted about emergent deliberate strategy. Steve Jobs was a guy who was very much the boss, but he knew how to learn from experience, and he knew how to adapt and talk about emergent as well as deliberate strategy, because a strategic visionary like Jobs has a kind of overview vision of strategy, but there's all kinds of adaptation and emergence within that umbrella. They're constantly adapting everything they possibly can. Okay, so I think that the way our corporations are going now, and just read the newspapers or watch what's going on, the way our corporations are going now, we're getting more and more corruption in our corporate practices. And by corruption, I don't just mean criminal corruption, I mean legal corruption. Executive compensation is legal corruption. That things that Goldman Sachs did with regard to recycled aluminum is legal corruption. They said we broke no laws. They were quoted in the New York Times as saying we broke no laws, and that's precisely the problem. That should have constituted the breaking of laws. And I carry this. I just did a book called Rebalancing Society. And so run out and buy it as soon as you leave the hall. And it's really about the imbalance that we're facing in society right now. The reason we're facing, I'll do this very quickly, but the reason, I think, a main reason we're facing imbalance is because we misinterpreted what happened in 1989. When the Berlin Wall fell, it fell on us, in the sense that we concluded that capitalism had triumphed in 1989. And I'm back to balance. Capitalism did not triumph in 89. Balance triumphed in 89. Before 1989, particularly since the war, the successful Western countries were balanced across their sectors. They had much stronger government, they had much stronger welfare programs, they had much higher taxes on the wealthy. And civil society, what I call the plural sector, was much stronger in a particular kind of way. But because of that misinterpretation, we've been going out of balance on the other side, on the side of private sectors. And it's killing us. It's denigrating our environments. It's leading to the demise of our democracies. Look at what money is doing to a country, it's just south of here, I won't mention its name, to a country that we view as the world's greatest democracy. And look what's happened with the role of money and the corruption in Congress and the buying of votes through legal political donations. Look what's happening in that country. And of course it's happening in every country, but worse in the United States. The United States is always... So, time to stop?
No, we're getting a little bit of feedback. I still have 5 minutes.
Yeah, I'm finished in a minute. Yeah, what do I do?
Just lean back a little. So
Okay. The degrading of our environments, the demise of our democracies, and the denigration of ourselves. And it's not just corporations. Everybody in this room is responsible. Every time you throw garbage down the chute and forget about it, and I throw garbage down the chute and forget about it, we're all contributing to it. So we're leading to a world that's out of balance, and I think it's significantly because of this very deliberate model of how you run organizations, how you run societies, and so on. And we, as business school faculty, are significantly responsible for that. So I think we ourselves have to wake up. We have to open our practice beyond strategy as practice to the practices that are destroying this world. That's my message, that's my own experience, and that's the evidence that I think is overwhelming. Thank you.